Right, well, hello everyone and welcome. My name is Jeff Mitchell and I work here at Rhodes Scholar. And it's my pleasure to host today's virtual lecture, Bridging the Divide, the Modern Civil Rights Movement. Now, these virtual lectures are free and available not just to our Rhodes Scholar participants, but are available for anyone who loves to learn. So please spread the word. This series of online lectures is critical to helping us pursue our not-for-profit mission of making learning accessible to as many lifelong learners as we can. And that includes those who do not have the physical ability, the financial means, or the option to leave their home and come join us on a Rhodes Scholar program. Ultimately, this series would not be possible without the support of viewers like you who have funded this project through many generous donations. So please, consider making a donation to not-for-profit Rhodes Scholar so that we can continue to provide educational experiences both in the classroom and on our 5,500 learning adventures all around the world in the future. Visit www.rhodesscholar.org/give to show your support with a monetary donation. Every dollar helps. So while the Rhodes Scholar headquarters is based in Boston, we have offices and staff all around the world. And today you'll be hearing from Tafeni English and David Hodge. Tafeni is the director of the Southern Poverty Law Center's Civil Rights Memorial Center in Montgomery, Alabama. And in addition to overseeing the Civil Rights Memorial Center, Tafeni regularly travels across the country to speak about combating hate and extremism. David is a teacher by profession and has been with the Southern Poverty Law Center for about a year and a half and has a passion for sharing the information that you will hear today with today's youths. They're both speakers on our Rhodes Scholar program, number 22657, the Civil Rights Movement, Atlanta, Montgomery, Selma, and Birmingham. Now, before we begin, a few quick housekeeping notes. Tafeni and David will present for approximately 30 minutes, and afterwards we will host a 10 to 15 minute Q&A session. Now, during this question and answer session, you can submit your questions using the Q&A buttons that are located down at the bottom of your screen. And afterwards, I will read a few questions live for them to answer. Now, there's a good amount of you here, so apologies if we do not get to your question. We will certainly try our best to get through as many as possible. Now, should technical issues force you to miss any portion of this webinar, do not worry. We will be adding a recording to our this lecture to our online virtual library afterwards for you all to see. And finally, at the end of our Q&A session and our time here together, you will be prompted to take just a very short survey, just like you're on a regular Rhodes Scholar program. And we ask that you please just take a few minutes to fill it out. Your feedback is immensely helpful to us and will help us improve and grow this virtual lecture series. So, without further ado, let's have a warm virtual welcome from our friends at the Southern Poverty Law Center, Tafeni English and David Hodge.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for having us. This is definitely an honor. We actually have large groups of Rhodes Scholars come through to visit the Civil Rights Memorial Center. And so David and I both are really excited about participating in this with you. As you heard from the introduction, I'm Tafeni English, Director of the Civil Rights Memorial Center, and my colleague David Hodge, who's the Educational Coordinator. And so when we do these presentations, we like to start at the memorial and the significance of the memorial that stands outside of the Civil Rights Memorial Center. We are a project of Southern Poverty Law Center, and if it were not for the 40 individuals on the martyrs and the many martyrs that we'll never know the names of, there would not be a Civil Rights Memorial, there would not be a Southern Poverty Law Center, because Southern Poverty Law Center was very much birthed out of the movement. The memorial out front was designed by Maya Lin, and inscribed in granite stone are the names of 40 people who were instrumental in the civil rights movement during the modern civil rights movement. And the dates that we highlight are 1954, beginning with the Brown versus Board of Education case and ending with the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But we also know that the movement did not end there, as we are still fighting for civil rights today. And so with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, David Hodge. Well, before I turn it over to David, I want to talk about one of the first cases, one of the early cases of Southern Poverty Law Center, and that was the case involving Southern Poverty Law Center against the United Klans of America. And in 1981, a young man by the name of Michael Donald was abducted, and he was hung in Mobile, Alabama, by 2 members of the United Klans of America. And at this time, Southern Poverty Law Center had been monitoring the Klan from an earlier case that they were also instrumental in. And at this time, the founder and co-founder decided that they wanted to take on the Klan and hold them responsible for the acts of the 2 individuals who murdered Michael Donald. So 5 months after the criminal case and the 2 men were convicted, Southern Poverty Law Center filed a civil suit on behalf of Mrs. Donald. And this civil suit actually bankrupted the United Klans of America. And a jury came back with one of the largest settlements at that time of $7 million, holding the United Klans of America responsible for the death of Michael Donald. This case was significant because so many of the martyrs that are on the memorial out front and so many other martyrs who are unnamed, there was never justice for their murders or for their killings. And so that was a very significant case, and it set a precedence for Southern Poverty Law Center to actually move forward with suing organized hate groups for and holding them responsible for the actions of their members. And there are several other cases throughout the years. One significant one was against the Aryan Nations in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Also a form of intimidation and violence against 2 individuals that they deemed who were not of the white race. And so Southern Poverty Law Center also took on that case and sued the Aryan Nations, and in essence bankrupted that group, and they disbanded and very loosely organized since those lawsuits. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, David Hodge.
Thank you for that, Tafeni. The SPLC is a nonprofit law firm, and we became a nonprofit law firm in the early 70s, 71 to be exact. The SPLC started out fighting for advancements of the civil rights movement that had been put into law but not necessarily enforced. And so there were a host of ways that the SPLC fought on behalf of poor people, people of color, women, people of different sexual orientations. And I'm going to talk to you about a few cases from the early days. The first case that I'll talk to you about is Smith versus the YMCA. And in this case, the city of Montgomery's Parks and Recreations Department conspired with the YMCA Board of Directors to recreate segregation, but under a different auspice. The Parks and Recreation Department actually conspired with the city to sell property to the YMCA at a deeply discounted rate. There were 4 YMCAs in the city of Montgomery. There was the Central YMCA, an Eastern YMCA. There was one downtown which was built, and then there was another one on the west side. And the one on the west side, the Cleveland Avenue YMCA, was the YMCA that was dedicated to servicing Black people. 2 cousins, Vincent Smith and Edward Smith, were trying to register for a summer camp called Camp Belser at Lake Jordan here in Alabama. And they were denied the opportunity to enroll. And so a lawsuit was brought. They were eventually admitted, but a lawsuit was brought because their parents felt that they were being discriminated against. The city and the YMCA created these YMCAs to replace public parks that had been closed once the Brown v. Board ruling was passed. So in '58, you start to see public pools filled with dirt and so that no integrated spaces would be used. And the YMCA, being a private facility, was then used as city recreational, as a space for city recreation. Um, this plot was uncovered by one of our founders. Um, and the argument that the defendants made in this case, that the YMCA made in this case, was that de facto segregation patterns were the cause of the YMCA membership and enrollment patterns. This was untrue, primarily because if you look at the busing, for one thing, there were Black people who lived near the downtown YMCA that were bused all the way out to Cleveland Avenue, right? So it was very much by design that these spaces were segregated. And another clue was that the YMCA membership in 1958 was around 1,000 people. And so in the early 60s, around 61, it had ballooned to 18,000 people. So through documents that our founders subpoenaed and through evidence such as these segregation patterns, we were able to win this case, and it was found in favor of the plaintiffs in this case, which desegregated the YMCAs of the city of Montgomery. Now, the second case that I'll talk to you about is Ralph V. Weinberger. And in this case, federal funds were used to practice eugenics against poor women, women of color, and women with intellectual disabilities, and women and children, by the way. The plaintiffs were Katie Ralph, Minnie Lee Ralph, and Mary Alice Ralph. And the defendant in this case was Casper Weinberger, who was the secretary of HUE, which later became the Department of Health and Human Services. The Office of Economic Opportunity, for those of you who don't know, was founded in '64 as a part of Johnson's War on Poverty. And the Office of Economic Opportunity did several things, but one of its functions was to teach people how to climb out of poverty by assisting them with behaviors. And one of those behaviors would be family planning. So social workers, what they were doing was taking people to these government-funded clinics and sterilizing people, especially poor women of color and women with intellectual disabilities. And that's what actually happened to Minnie Lee and Mary Alice Ralph. They were residents of the Smiley Court Housing Project here on the west side of Montgomery. Their mother was given a form. She wasn't told what the purpose of the form was. The mother was illiterate. She signed with an X, which in effect gave consent for the two children to be sterilized. They were taken to a family planning clinic, which again was government funded, federally funded rather. And they were, two ligations were performed on Minnie Lee and Mary Alice Ralph. The social workers a lot of times would leverage the welfare benefits of folks, saying that they would be cut off from welfare if they would not go through with different family planning measures. And Katie Ralph was actually given experimental birth control, the Depo-Provera shot, and they weren't told what the purpose of these shots were. The Southern Poverty Law Center brought a suit against Casper Weinberger, who's the director of HUE. They were transitioning, the government was transitioning from having the OEO supervise this to having HUE, the HUE office, supervise this. And there was a memorandum that wasn't released. And so they weren't following protocols as far as requiring informed consent when it came to practicing these procedures of tubal ligation and birth control. And so the SPLC, while we didn't win this suit, the case wound up being dismissed. It brought to light the heinous idea that as many as 100,000 to 150,000 poor women, women of color, and women with intellectual disabilities were sterilized in a lot of cases without having given informed consent. And so going forward, the government then required informed consent in all cases. Now, our space, the Civil Rights Memorial Center, is dedicated to 40 people. And these 40 people are martyrs that they're people that we consider martyrs of the civil rights movement. We honor some folks that are notable, and then we honor some folks that you might not have heard of. And so I'll talk to you about a few of these folks. The first person that you see pictured here is Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers was a leader of the civil rights movement in the state of Mississippi. It's hard to talk about civil rights activity in the state of Mississippi without mentioning his name. And so for that reason, I won't tell you too much that you've already heard, but I just want to share with you some things. Medgar Evers was born in Decatur, Mississippi. At 14, he witnessed a lynching of a family friend by the name of Willie Tingle. Willie Tingle was dragged through town. He was then shot and hanged, and his clothes were left in that spot where his body was hanged. And Medgar Evers actually had to walk past the spot where this man was killed, past those bloody clothes for months. Medgar Evers was a veteran. He enlisted in the Army and served in World War II. And then when he came back, he started to become an activist, right? He managed to register to vote in 1946. However, he was denied access to the ballot through voter intimidation. He tried to apply to law school at Ole Miss. However, his entry was denied on a technicality, and it was primarily motivated by the fact that Ole Miss wanted to remain segregated. Medgar Evers became an insurance salesman, and he sold insurance door to door. And as he sold insurance, he wound up talking to people about what insurance was, trying to explain that. And as he would talk to them, he would also talk to them about their rights, about the importance of voting registration, about the importance of organizing. Now, Medgar Evers worked for an insurance company called Magnolia Mutual Life, which was owned by T.R.M. Howard, a Black doctor in the area of Mississippi, right? T.R.M. Howard also founded the Regional Council of Negro Leadership. And so as the Regional Council of Negro Leadership organized small-scale boycotts in rural areas of Mississippi. And Medgar Evers actually participated in organizing one of these boycotts in the Clarksdale area of Mississippi. And the idea behind these boycotts was that you don't have to spend your money where you're not being treated fairly. And in fact, that organization sold bumper stickers that said, "Don't buy gas where you can't use the restroom," right? Medgar Evers wound up moving to Jackson and becoming the field secretary for the NAACP later in his life. In Jackson, he was known as a grassroots organizer, and without access, consistent access to the radio or television, he managed to organize large-scale boycotts. He also investigated the deaths of some of the notable folks who were killed in Mississippi in the effort to suppress the vote. And he investigated the deaths of folks like Emmett Till, Reverend George Lee, just to name a couple people. Medgar Evers, of course, as we know, was killed by Byron D. LeBeckwith in 1963. Medgar Evers was shot outside of his home. He and his wife had put in security measures. They had put gravel on the roof so that if a bomb were to be thrown, it would slide off. There was no front door. They had side access. And Medgar Evers had actually used his military training to teach his wife and kids to exit using their car as cover, just in case somebody were trying to attack. These efforts were unsuccessful, and as I said, he wound up being killed. There were three trials that were held. After Medgar Evers was killed, Byron D. LeBeckwith was known to have done it, and they did not secure a conviction in that case until 1994. And Byron D. LeBeckwith spent the last 7 years of his life in jail for killing Medgar Evers. Now, this man right here is somebody that you might not be familiar with. This was Corporal Roman Ducksworth. And Corporal Roman Ducksworth was in the military. He was stationed at Fort Meade, and he traveled back home to visit his wife, who was having their baby. When he arrived in town on a bus in Taylorsville, Mississippi, which was his hometown, Corporal Roman Ducksworth was mistaken for a freedom rider. The local sheriff, William Kelly, boarded a bus, saw Corporal Roman Ducksworth asleep on that bus, and attacked him because he thought that he was a freedom rider. They got into a brief physical altercation because Corporal Roman Ducksworth fought back. He was a military police officer, and he used that training in self-defense. William Kelly was actually slapped to his knees, and then he used his gun in place of his baton. He shot Corporal Roman Ducksworth one time in the chest, wounding and killing him. Roman Ducksworth's sister-in-law and nephew were there to pick him up from the bus station, and he actually died in his nephew's arms. The next day, a grand jury was convened, and the defense that the sheriff used was he accused Roman Ducksworth of being drunk. The jury ruled it a justified homicide, and no charges were brought against that local sheriff. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this is part of the historical context of police brutality. I think in the wake of everything that we've experienced as a nation in recent months, it's very important to remember that these things have been happening. That when we look at recent events, like when I was a kid, the the Rodney King verdict, or after Freddie Gray was killed, or after Mike Brown was killed, the civil unrest that occurred, a lot of that unrest can be contextualized by the fact that there is a historical context for this type of violence, and that it continues, right? And there's also an erasure of people like Katherine Johnston, Rakia Boyd, Tarika Wilson, right? Black women, a lot of times, their deaths at the hands of police go overlooked. Now, if we look here, this is Virgil Ware. Virgil Ware was a young man. He was 13 years old, and he was killed in Birmingham, Alabama. Now, Birmingham had a reputation for violence. Its nickname, as we know, was Bombingham. And there were over 40 unsolved bombings in Birmingham over the course of the Civil Rights Movement. On the day of the 16th Street bombing, Virgil Ware was riding on the handlebars of his brother's bike. He was shot twice by two 16-year-olds who had left a segregationist rally. They shot him in the head and chest and killed him, and they were eventually arrested and put on trial. They were given probation after being sentenced to 7 years and having that sentence removed. Now, it's important to remember that when we think about the 16th Street bombing and other attacks in Birmingham, a lot of people get the impression that they were random acts of violence. But I want to give you a sense of how targeted these acts of violence were. The 16th Street bombing was an attack on a place where they organized for the Civil Rights Movement. Earlier that year, they had the Children's Crusades of '63, and that church was a place where they held meetings to train kids, and marches actually left from that church. 11 days before Virgil Ware was killed and before the 16th Street bombing, Arthur Shores, the lawyer who fought to integrate Birmingham city schools, his home was bombed. And this was the second bombing attempt within 15 days. There was an earlier bombing attempt on August 20th. And then there was a third attempted bombing that was unsuccessful. Now, Arthur Shores had fought to integrate both the University of Alabama and the Birmingham City Schools. And he had actually won the case to integrate Birmingham City Schools on the day that his home was bombed. That evening, they had riots in that part of Birmingham. And there was a part of Birmingham named Dynamite Hill, Smithfield, which is on Center Street. And that was the dividing line racially between where Black people lived and where white people lived. And Black people were encroaching on the white part of town. So the fact that Arthur Shore's home was bombed this many times, the fact that the 16th Street church was targeted, it was used as a deterrent and to civil rights activity. And the idea is, if we target the lawyers, if we kill the lawyer, if we bomb the church where you're organizing, then maybe we can deter the tide toward integration and equality, right? The last thing that I'll share with you is this slide right here. This slide right here is about the work that we're currently doing today. And we believe that the civil rights work that we talk about inspired the work that goes on today, right? Our motto at the Civil Rights Memorial Center is that the march continues, right? And the efforts of the civil rights movement inform the social justice and human rights work that we see today.
Thank you, David. So David just provided an overview, of why we honor the martyrs and why we feel it's so important to keep their stories alive with the Civil Rights Memorial Center. As I said at the top of the presentation, if there were not a civil rights movement, then there wouldn't be a Southern Poverty Law Center, because again, it was very much birthed out of the movement, which is one of the reasons that the founder and co-founder started Southern Poverty Law Center. It started out as a private law firm where they were taking on pro bono cases, basically in the Deep South, after legislation was passed for civil rights enforcement. And what they realized was that in the South, that would be a very hard upheaval battle, because there was so much resistance to the passage of civil rights laws. There was so much resistance to integration. And so Southern Poverty Law Center started by taking on cases. David talked about the YMCA case. I talked about cases when they started suing the Klan, but they also took on cases that dealt with employment, where people were being unfairly left out of jobs because of the color of their skin. They did housing work. And so it just ran the gamut. And over the years, eventually, after serving as a private law firm for a few years, they decided to incorporate Southern Poverty Law Center as a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and the work expanded. Primarily, they were focused on impact litigation, and that mainly involved some of the earlier cases we talked about, where people were refusing to apply civil rights legislation in the Deep South. And then it evolved to tackling white supremacist groups. And over the years, we're nearing 50 years in existence, the legal practice groups have expanded. And we also have our teaching tolerance department, which was started in the early 90s as a result of years of monitoring the activity of white supremacist organization and Klan organizations. The board of directors and founders actually talked about how they would prevent kind of white supremacy organization or people being recruited to them, how they could really deal with people not believing that Black people were equal or should have access to adequate housing or education, and this whole notion that we can't live together. And so the Teaching Tolerance Department was founded, and we'll talk about that in another slide. But I just wanted to really talk a little bit about some of the other practice groups, highlighting one. We have a children's rights practice group, and they're dedicated to children's rights, and they're working to ensure that vulnerable children have equal opportunities to reach their full potential. Some of the cases that they take on involve mental health issues in schools. They just recently sued Nancy DeVos. And so there's a lot of litigation going on in various areas, and where our focus was primarily like on groups and things of that nature, we're now focused on policy and changing policies as it relates to that. So the litigation is expanding. We also have our economic justice practice group, and our economic practice group, I think they're doing an amazing job, because they're actually taking on things like bail-related work. They're tackling debtors' prisons. They recently had a panhandling lawsuit here in the state of Alabama. Some of the things that they're doing with the debtors' prison is they're actually working, and this is primarily in Mississippi, working with municipal courts so that people, mainly poor Black people and Native American residents who are confined with these large fines and court fees, that they are in essence preventing these roadblocks for those participants. And some of the bail related work also includes challenging state laws with regard to these bail bond companies who are overcharging poor Black people, mainly in the Deep South. And so it just keeps them in this perpetual state of debt, and in some cases jail time.
Right.
So, yeah. David, can I add to that?
Yeah, we also protect the rights of immigrants through our Immigrant Justice Project and our Southern Immigrant Freedom Initiative. What we do with that is we provide direct services in some of the facilities where immigrants have been detained, at Folkestone and Lumpkin and Jenna, just to name a few. We work to protect their due process rights. We also hold law enforcement accountable when it comes to the detention facilities, and we hold them accountable and responsible for the civil rights of the detainees, the people who've been detained. We challenge deportation. We also educate the public about immigrants and debunk falsehoods, right? We're in light of this COVID crisis, as we know, it's very difficult to socially distance in a detention facility, given the pictures and video that we've seen of the conditions under which the immigrants are being held. So we're working to end facility transfers, which, as we know, increases the likelihood that COVID could spread. We're fighting for people with symptoms to be tested for COVID, and also folks with high risk factors. We are working at this from several angles, right? The Southeast Immigrant Freedom Initiative is working to end and oppose family separation, to oppose the barriers created for asylum. As we know, the current administration has put several barriers in place, including a turnback policy, a quote unquote remain in Mexico policy, and also a policy in which people who seek asylum in the US have to have sought asylum in another country, especially folks who have traveled through several countries to get to the US. They have to apply for asylum in another country before applying for asylum here. We are working to monitor the relationship between local law enforcement and its support of the immigration dragnet as well. As we know, the current administration has been punishing sanctuary cities and providing funding for local law enforcement agencies that are willing to be a part of the immigration dragnet, so to speak. And here,
Sorry.
oh,
Oh, go ahead, David.
I was just going to say, here we have a photo of some of the folks who work with our Voting Rights Project. Voter suppression, as we know, is something that historically occurred through intimidation and violence during the Civil Rights Movement. And as we got a Voting Rights Act that had teeth to it with Section 5, that there was opposition. That opposition never really went away. Right? In the state of Alabama, there were over 700 attempts to change voting laws and election procedures, 100 of which actually went to the DOJ, which had the power to supervise election procedures. So you can imagine the fervor with which people were still willing to engage in voter suppression. And then, of course, the recent Supreme Court case, Shelby versus Holder, gutted Section 5 of the the Voting Rights Act, taking away the pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act, and therefore allowing people carte blanche to kind of engage in new iterations of voter suppression.
And I just want to add to David gave a very good overview of that, the public education and civic engagement piece to the Voter Rights Practice Group, which is a new practice group. But we, with the public education and civic engagement, we have the Vote Your Voice initiative, which was just recently launched in June in partnership with the Community Foundation of Greater Atlanta. And that is a $30 million investment that will go to grassroots organizations who are on the ground, primarily in the Deep South. And there are other states that were also impacted by the Eric versus Holder Supreme Court decision that gutted the Voting Rights Act. And so we know over the last several years that groups have really been on the ground. And today, as the country memorializes and says their final farewell to Congressman John Lewis, I can't help but to think about his plight with pushing forward the importance of everyone having the right to vote. And with that, we also have the election protection efforts that were also very instrumental in this recent election, the primaries in June. And if you all, of course, have been keeping up with the media, David mentioned COVID-19 and just its impact on voting, but people were out risking their lives to vote and still were met with so many barriers and opposition to getting to the poll. And with that, we do have organizers who travel throughout the Deep South to educate individuals on their right to vote, also helping to mobilize and organize so that people are registered to vote as well. And so I just wanted to highlight that about the Voting Rights Practice Group. And this next slide is just a short video that you know, the words of Dr. King ring true even today. So I'll let David share this clip.
We must realize that we are grappling with the most weighty social problem of this nation. Give us the ballot.
Went to the polls to vote, and my name was not on the list to be able to vote. They had me fill out an absentee ballot.
Give us the right to vote. All types of conniving methods are still being used. The denial of this sacred right is a tragic betrayal of the highest mandates of our democratic tradition.
We forget, or we don't know, the struggles that people have had to overcome. We learn about it, but neglect to understand what they've really been through. We actually have a voice. It's real.
The civil rights issue is not an ephemeral, evanescent domestic issue that can be kicked about by reactionary guardians of the status quo. It is rather an eternal moral issue, which may well determine the destiny of our nation.
I look back on the legacy of our past people. That's the whole reason of me going out to vote. I think about all the people that died in March for us to have this right and how important it is to pass it on down.
Give us the ballot. 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 Give us the ballot.
Okay, thank you. And so again, just to reiterate, you know, our voting rights practice group continues to organize and mobilize around that, in addition to a number of litigation cases, one recently here in the state of Alabama, ensuring that people would have a safe and accessible way to vote in future elections. David?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So we mentioned teaching tolerance, and now just a little bit about the Intelligence Project. The Intelligence Project is the arm of Southern Poverty Law Center that continues to monitor extremist groups throughout the country. In addition to that, they also travel the country speaking about the harm of the white supremacist organization or the hate groups. They also continue to distribute reports about the nature of the hate groups and other issues that are impacting our country. A recent report was on Stephen Miller, who is actually in the White House. So I know we don't have a lot more time, but I do encourage people to actually visit our website to download that report. But for the purpose of this presentation, we wanted to talk about just the number of hate groups. This number is actually from last year. We have an active hate group of 1,020, and the number went down slightly. I think is it 988, David?
Yes,
somewhere in there. And so as you can see, hate groups are concentrated throughout our country. Oftentimes, I know people think that that's isolated to a certain part of the country, but it is not. Hate and racism exist in every corner, right, of our nation. And so the Intelligence Project does a really great job of researching and identifying hate groups to place them on the hate group map. And I do encourage you all, again, to visit our website to see that section of the website so that you can learn more about the different hate groups. So we have the Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazi, white nationalist groups, Christian identity, neo-Confederate, Black nationalist group, and the list goes on. But the website does break it down and give you a good overview of what those groups believe, the ideology that they follow, and also you can click on the map to see where they are in the country, where they're actually organized and mobilized. And this is just a progression that just shows, you know, kind of when hate groups are on the rise and when they decline. And I'll just say primarily what impacts the rise of hate groups, one is our political culture and environment. The second would be where our economy is. And then the driving force now is this whole notion that there's going to be a white genocide. That is what has contributed to the increase over the last several years, where there's this fundamental belief that the white race will at some point become extinct. And so we just put that in there for those purposes. David, did you have anything to add?
I was just going to say that that whole notion of a white genocide and then displacement by migrant populations is a motivation for the rise of white nationalism within the U.S. and globally as well, right? Yeah. And that is, in fact, one of the things that motivated Dylan Roof, who was the shooter in the Charleston shooting as well.
Yes, thank you. Okay. So now we're open for Q&A.
Well, thank you so much, David and Tafeni. That was excellent. Everyone, we're going to start our Q&A session now. So again, if you have a question for our friends at the Southern Poverty Law Center, you can do so by submitting it through the Q&A feature located down at the bottom of your screen. But to get us started, David and Tafeni, I think today is a very important day with celebrating the life of John Lewis. Stan is wondering, you know, what can we do best right now in order to carry on his dream?
So I definitely feel if you're in an area to get involved with ensuring that people have a safe and accessible way to get to the polls. I would also, I just can't stress this enough, how important voting is, because it's all of our civic duty, right? It is our civic duty to do that. I've been voting since I was legal enough, you know, of age to vote. And I don't take it for granted. I believe our vote is our voice. And so if there's some local efforts that you can get involved, we encourage that. We also, you can visit our website. We don't have, per se, any volunteer opportunities. What we're doing is we're connecting people to local efforts within their communities to do that. And I think we can best honor Congressman John Lewis with that. David?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Like that is definitely what his legacy was and what he stood for. And one of the ways that I would suggest is if you have a way to become a nonpartisan poll monitor. I recently went through that training, and it's just fascinating to see all of the different iterations of voter suppression. Some of them seem innocuous on the surface, but they're definitely insidious in the fact that they create a barrier for people being able to participate in our democracy. And there are things like voting places being moved without people being told that they've been moved, and things like putting the polling place in like police stations in communities that don't necessarily have the best relationship with police. So there are things that even on the surface seem like good ideas that are actually forms of voter suppression. So if you have a chance to go through that poll monitor training, I definitely suggest that, even if you can just be a lookout at your own polling station and report to one of these organizations that's monitoring efforts to suppress the vote.
Great suggestion. Thanks, David. I have a question here from Lois, who is wondering, you know, given this COVID world that we're all now living in, how best are you guys able to reach people in order to get them to vote?
So I know, of course, with technology, we've been doing a lot of things with regard to technology. The other thing is our Florida case was actually, it was streamed live, like they did it all virtually, right? So even courts are finding ways to be creative in this. The other thing is the Vote Your Voice initiative, which went to fund groups who were out educating, organizing, and mobilizing. And a lot of them needed additional funding because they were having to adjust because of COVID-19. So those are some of the ways that we've been able to reach people. And of course, social media is powerful in its own right. And so really a robust social media campaign around all of our voting rights issues has been instrumental in that. And again, we certainly couldn't do it without our supporters as well, because they're on email lists and newsletters, and we're engaging our supporters in that way as well.
That's great. Thank you, Tafeni. I have a question here from Maureen, who is wondering, is the center working on rights restorations for former felons in Florida and the rest of the United States?
Yes, specifically in Florida, there was a recent case in Florida where we had a slight victory and then it was overturned. But we are working now on additional litigation with regard to that. But not only are we doing it in Florida, Florida is our high profile case because that's where the first lawsuit was, but we're also working on efforts in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. And a lot of that is our partnerships with local grassroots organizations who are doing that work as well.
I've got a few questions from a few different participants who are wondering, I mean, it seems like there's a lot that your organization is doing. How many different lawyers do you fund, and where do you get your funding? There's a lot of questions people want to know, just the scope and sequence of the organization.
Okay, so I think at one point we had almost 100 attorneys, well, attorneys and paralegals, right? So our legal department is comprised of legal directors who are all attorneys. And then we have deputy legal directors who are over specific departments. Then we have managing attorneys who manage and oversee certain pockets of litigation. And then we have our outreach paralegals, and we also have advocates in the legal department. And so it's a comprehensive legal department, and they are also now to the point where they are they're determining how best to do community work as well as litigation. But all of our attorneys are on staff. We don't have, I think, if I'm interpreting the question right, we don't have outside attorneys that we fund, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
And how does the Southern Poverty Law Center, how are you guys funded?
We're funded through donations from individuals. Yeah. And some of our work does have foundation grants. So like if we're working on a specific issue with the Intelligence Project, that may have a foundation grant. The one thing I can think of is working on hate crimes. There's a group, a foundation that funds that work.
Now I've got a question here from Trisha and Miles. I'm going to kind of combine here. They're wondering about your work with partnering with other different organizations. Do you ever work with the ACLU or the Equal Justice Initiative on cases together to prosecute hate crimes? Or?
Well, so EJI doesn't do hate crime work, but when it's specific to the work, we have partnered with the Equal Justice Initiative, and we've also partnered with the ACLU. Typically, that's on a local level and not on a national level. So locally, we have partnered with the ACLU. We work with the ACLU here on several prison cases, and also with EJI. It's the same thing, prison cases that we've collaborated and worked with them on.
Mm-hmm. And Patricia would like to know, it seems like a lot of your work is confined. Is it just confined to the South, or are you guys working around the country?
No, we, with our Teaching Tolerance and the Intelligence Project, that's around the country, right? Most of our litigation has happened in the South, but we have had litigation that's happened outside of the South. But a lot of the work is in the South. David, did you want to add to that?
I was just going to say that some of our impact litigation has gone outside of the South, like with our LGBTQ rights group. There was a case in New Jersey where we sued and won a case that people were providing conversion therapy, and we sued for under the auspice that it was fraudulent to do so.
I have a question here from Lee, who is wondering, what do you perceive to be the most critical issues facing your organization at this time, and what is your plan of action moving forward?
A lot. Yeah, I think it varies from each program, right? So with teaching tolerance, I know right now at the forefront is really continuing to engage with educators, but having to do that very differently around COVID-19, right? With the Intelligence Project, they're also expanding their work. And so outside of the work that they're doing, monitoring and researching white supremacist organizations, they're also looking at research and education to use those as tools, and how they also connect with educators, right? How they connect outside of law enforcement and those things. So it really varies. And legal, I just, I almost feel like the sky's the limit, because all of our work touches almost every form of system that there is: housing, education, looking at policy, and, looking at voter suppression, looking at criminal justice reform. And that's outside of prisons. That's even like how people are being prosecuted, right? So it varies. David, did you want to add to that?
No, I think that was spot on.
Well, I think we have time for one more question. I have a question here from Susan, who wants to know, as a non-lawyer, how can we get involved with the Southern Poverty Law Center?
David, do you want me to go, or you want to go?
Well, I'll say this. One of the things that we encourage people to do is get involved on the ground where you are. So the Southern Poverty Law Center doesn't have a lot of volunteering opportunities per se, but we do partner with community organizations who are already doing the work, right? So that may mean, like, if you're passionate about voter suppression, like, you may want to get involved with an organization that's registering people. You may want to get involved with people that are doing poll monitoring. If that has to do with LGBTQ rights, you may want to get involved with a local affiliated organization that's pushing for those advancements, or get involved with an organization that's doing some sort of form of immigrant justice work. So that is primarily the way that we encourage people to get involved. And if you'd like to add to that, Tiffany.
No, I think that's what we, yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. I'm rambling.
Well, it's great advice. I really appreciate that. And I'm sure all of our viewers watching here can take it to heart. So thank you, everyone. That is all the time we have for today. Again, I'd like to thank our expert instructors, David Hodge and Tafeni English, for their wonderful presentation today. Again, you can see them out in person on our Rhodes Scholar program number 22657, the Civil Rights Movement, Atlanta, Montgomery, Selma, and Birmingham. Rhodes Scholar is working on a wider project that aims to provide resources and interactive opportunities for participants to learn about topics of social justice. Part one of this project is a new Facebook group that we've created to engage those participants interested in anti-racism and other social justice learning. So if you're interested in joining this new group or learning more about this project, please email socialjustice@rhodesscholar.org. A big thank you to all of you for joining us today. Again, should you wish to donate to Rhodes Scholar, the link to do so again is www.rhodesscholar.org/give. A big thank you to all our presenters one more time. Thank you very much. We will see you all next time.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.